Olá! Começa agora o Fronteiras do Pensamento. No programa de hoje, exibiremos a segunda parte da conferência, a Estética da Singularidade, com Fredric Jameson. O professor e crítico literário destaca os desdobramentos da singularidade no pensamento pós-moderno. Como esses conceitos se refletem na ciência, na filosofia, nas experiências humanas e na política. Como se deu a transição entre modernismo e pós-modernidade? E o que a globalização tem a ver com isso? Essas e outras questões, agora no Fronteiras do Pensamento.
In postmodernity, singularity can be used in at least 4 different contexts. First, no doubt, would come the scientific use, where it doesn't seem clear, at least to me, whether the term means something beyond physical laws we know it, or something anomalous which has not yet been explained by scientists, but which will eventually fall under an enlarged scientific law of some new kind, yet to be theorized. What's useful here is then the notion of a singularity event, like a black hole, which, as in the financial dynamics of derivatives we just outlined, lies on the border between an unrepeatable event in time of some sort and a unique structure which may come together just once, but which is nonetheless a structure of some kind and susceptible to some kind of structural analysis. In science fiction, this singularity becomes the dominant ambiguity, but rather than with the black holes and subatomic peculiarities of the physicists, it is linked to computers and artificial intelligence. Here, in the science fictional use of the term, the singularity is projected as a leap or revolutionary mutation of some sort, something that can be dystopian or utopian, depending on the context. Dystopian singularity would be the emergence of a mechanical species that transcends the human in intelligence and in malignity, as in the Terminator series or Battlestar Galactica. Utopian would then be the emergence of the post-human in the hitherto human species, a kind of mutation of the human in a new hybrid or android type of superhuman intelligence within our own human nature. This seems the farthest from the usage that interests us here, save that its visionary notion of a period or evolutionary leap does somehow correspond to the old modernist teleology of art: make it new, invention, destruction of the past, emergence of new perceptions and new forms of experience, and even new kinds of human beings, as in avant-garde or revolutionary politics. This utopian strain is then still very much a subterranean current in contemporary or post-contemporary science fiction, and thus testifies to the ongoing awareness of a historical change, as well as the stirrings of some deeply buried and feeble sense of history and the future. Clearly, it's the philosophical notion of singularity which is the crucial one for us, insofar as it steadfastly repudiates traditional philosophical notions of universals and of the traditional scheme of those particulars or individuals which are subsumed under universals. The concept of singularity, but can one even call it a philosophical concept in that sense? The concept of singularity breaks with all that and posits a focus on the absolutely unique. This is in fact a return to the old quarrel between realism and nominalism in the Middle Ages, where universals, Platonic ideas, are considered mere empty words designed to bring order to a world of absolutely unique and ungeneralizable things and substances. Universals are thus mere flatus vocis, empty sounds which have little enough to do with reality. In this sense, we are indeed back in medieval philosophy and the quarrel of nominalism against universalism, and to that degree Adorno is right to identify the return of nominalism as a fundamental feature of modernity, and for us even more of post-modernity. Adorno's polemics, however, were directed against the reemergence of nominalism in all its various forms. Indeed, what I've called the reduction to the body and to the present of time is a kind of nominalism in existential experience. He opposes it, however, not from the scholastic perspective of the universals or even the Platonic ideas, but rather from the dialectical one. And to be sure, from a dialectical perspective, one can read nominalism as a denial of the dialectic's absent totalities and as the basis for that empiricism which has always been the target of what we still call contemporary theory. Thus, on a lower philosophical level, what we've been calling nominalism, to which this very concept of singularity is affiliated, is an ambiguous matter. It can mean the empiricism of the non-dialectical Anglo-American tradition, that is to say, the instrumental thinking of a business society and of capitalism generally. Here, it is institutional thought and value which is wedded to nominalism, and Adorno opposes its gradual stifling of negativity, negative critical thinking on all its functional levels, and of the eradication of critical thinking generally, and of any movement towards systemic change. I want to pause here to observe that I don't consider the description I've been giving here to be some properly postmodern philosophy on my part. There is such a thing nowadays. There are philosophers who endorse what they call postmodern philosophy as their slogan. And I believe that such a philosophy is associated with two specific causes or slogans, namely anti-essentialism and anti-foundationalism. These may be described as the struggle against any normative idea of human nature and the repudiation of any ultimate metaphysical system, any idea of nature itself as such. I'm perfectly willing to endorse these principles, to which I would add constructivism and also a certain historicism. That's often called relativism by the philosophical enemies of so-called postmodern philosophy. But all these principles were already inherent in Sartrean existentialism, and so their compression into a single program is scarcely surprising, at least to me, who was always a Sartrean in the first place anyway. But I'm not now in the process of proselytizing or advertising for this as a new philosophical system. Rather, I'm here taking so-called postmodern philosophy as yet another symptom of postmodernity as such, along with all the other features I've been describing, such as the work of art, food, derivatives, and so forth. Indeed, in order to grasp the significance of postmodern philosophy, we must move from the philosophical level to the socio-political one, in which the struggle against universals inherent in the very concept of singularity is a struggle against hegemonic norms and institutional values, whether cultural or juridical. Universals are here felt to be normative and thereby oppressive and binding on minorities and on individuals. If you posit some universal human nature, in other words, you're already affirming a norm from which all deviations, whether collective or individual, can be denounced and condemned. And to denounce such norms becomes a burning political issue, as in identity politics and the politics of secessionist groups and marginal or oppressed cultures. For at their outer limit, the hegemonic or oppressive norm can reach genocide and the ideals of ethnic cleansing, something we witness everywhere as a reaction against imperialism, standardization, and against the deterioration of national autonomies under globalization. Yet, even this seemingly legitimate resistance to oppressive norms and universals remains dialectically ambivalent. The most dramatic examples are to be found in the areas of feminism and gender preference. For to assert universal rights for women is also necessarily to challenge cultures in which another status of women is prescribed. The doctrine of universal human rights is still a doctrine of universals. Yet the repudiation of such universals is equally contradictory. For just as individual cultures can challenge the universal norm of an ascribed human nature, nowadays it's generally an American one, I'm sorry to say, so also women can challenge the universalizing norm inherent in this or that cultural custom or law. Singularity would in that sense seem to remain a purely individual affair and untranslatable to a collective equivalent unless that collectivity affirms its own uniqueness and singularity, an affirmation that generally nowadays seems to take the form of religion. Now, we have very little time to deal with what are perhaps our most important topics, the transformation of subjectivity and lived experience in the postmodern, and the transformation of politics. You understand that as with philosophy, I have my own opinions and my own judgments, my own preferences about all these things, but I'm trying as much as possible to give a relatively neutral description of historical change, a historical change on all levels, which I believe to have happened or to be in the process of happening. It is not a transition from one mode of production or even one society to another. We're still very much within capitalism, but it is at least a change from one moment of capitalism to another and has momentous consequences for all kinds of structures and experiences, as I've tried to show. As for subjectivity itself and personal experience, I've already mentioned a kind of displacement from the experience of time to that of space. But surely the center of our subjective experience, our phenomenological or existential experience, remains temporal. We would then in that case need to see what temporality feels like under the regime of space. And I think this involves something more drastic than the old Bergsonian critique of spatial experience in terms of some deep time or élan vital. I think it could be argued that all the fascination of modernism with deep time, not only in Bergson, of course, but also in Thomas Mann or Proust, that such fascination derived in that period, or early 20th century, from the unevenness of the modernizing world, the coexistence of slower village or rural temporalities with the dizzying rapidity of the big cities and of industrialization. Modernism was in that sense the expression of incomplete modernization. And we can draw the conclusion that the postmodern is what we get when modernization is complete. When the countryside is abolished, that is to say, when the peasantry have become wage workers and the older agriculture has been transformed into agribusiness. Now, in this more complete modernization, even the differences between industrial labor and the life of the city bourgeoisie is effaced. Everyone is middle class, everyone has become a consumer, everyone is unemployed, everything has become a shopping mall. Space has become an infinite extension of surfaces which are images, and difference, a temporal phenomenon, has given way to identity and standardization. You'll observe that this is still only true in a few privileged spaces and countries in the world, but that makes my point, namely that today what constituted uneven development locally and nationally has now been projected onto a global scale. Culture itself has become a space of uneven development, as we find reflected in such works as Pascal Casanova's World Republic of Letters. The connection to globalization is now clear. This sense of a global or world scale could not have been possible in the modern period, the period of imperialism, of metropolises and colonies. It could only have become possible after decolonization. But in our present context, it's rather of business that we have to speak than of national liberation, and it's not even of immense new multinational corporations, vastly beyond anything Lenin had in mind by monopoly in an older modernist period. We must speak here of the communications technologies that make these gigantic business transnationals possible, and this is a topic which leads in many directions. McLuhan would certainly have identified the computer and the internet with fundamental modifications of subjectivity, and he would have been right. The cultural specialists in media technology would then have their own word to speak on its transformation of the body and the phenomenology of the object world. It seems to me no accident that cultural theory today has been so radically transformed by the technological perspectives of the new media. We've already underscored the significance of finance capital. In this context, however, it remains to stress the way in which, computerization, spatial distance is now translated into a virtual temporal simultaneity, and in which, in other words, here too, space abolishes time. Investments, speculation, the selling off of whole national currencies, divestments, acquisitions, the commodification of a future you can still buy and sell. The newer communications technologies have accelerated these processes to the point where the passage of time, Bergsonian durée, has been virtually eliminated. As can be imagined, such an eclipse of time passing, seriously modifies human experience if it does not, in fact, gravely amputate it. Walter Benjamin already saw this coming when he evoked the emergence of the dream bird of fantasy from the melancholy egg of boredom. Nobody's bored anymore. There are no longer any provinces or any provincials. In the 20th century, the filmmaker Ken Russell predicted that in the 21st century, standard feature films would run no longer than 15 minutes. And in a sense, he was right, and popular culture gives us many hints about this phenomenon, whose equivalent is the disappearance of plot. Action films today really have no plot. The latter is a pretext for explosive events that fill up minute after minute of the viewing. I call this the end of temporality, as I said, the reduction to the body and to the present of time. What is sought for is an intensity of the present. The before and after tends to disappear. And clearly enough, this is something that also happens to our sense of history. No previous societies have had as little functional memory, as little sense of the historical past as this one, and clearly the disappearance of the past entails the disappearance of the future as well in the long term. No one believes in long-term societal change any longer. Our present is hemmed in by an evaluation of the past as either failed or successful modernization. Simply means getting rich. And by a conception of the future as impending natural and ecological disaster. Such are only some of the consequences of a primacy of space over time in postmodernity. Now, all of this has much to do with the transformation of the individual subject today. At the first stirrings of postmodernity, the structuralists and post-structuralists spoke of the death of the subject, by which they meant, in less melodramatic language, the increasing fragility and vulnerability of the older bourgeois individualism, its deterioration under conditions of large-scale institutions, and the decline of that capitalist competition which brought individualism into being in the first place as an acquisitive and aggressive ego and a powerful and Oedipal identity. All of the features I've attributed to some properly postmodern subjectivity are to be understood in terms of that process. The reduction to the present, the body as some last reality to survive the exhaustion of bourgeois culture, the mutability and changeability, variability of mood or affect, replacing the self-confident stances of an older emotional system. How much the more so, then, will not subjectivity be transformed when opened to the vicissitudes of that even vaster landscape which is globalization itself? No longer protected by family or region, nor even by nation itself and national identity, the emergence of the vulnerable subject into a world of billions of anonymous equals is bound to bring about still more momentous changes in individual existential human reality. This is the moment when we pass over from postmodern subjectivity to the new social conditions of postmodernity, which have been characterized politically by what is often called identity politics. But we have to be more precise about such terms, whose dialectic confronts us with an unexpected paradox. It's a noteworthy and revealing symptomatic social fact, for example, that the term identity politics is just as appropriately and just as often termed the politics of difference. And this almost Hegelian equivalent of identity and difference affords a significant insight into the nature of this new political phenomenon, which is not to be confused with an older nationalist or ethnic or religious dynamic. In hindsight, we can look at globalization, or this third stage of capitalism, as the other side or face of that immense movement of decolonization and liberation which took place all over the world in the 1960s. The first two stages of capitalism, the period of national industries and markets, followed by that of imperialism and the acquisition of colonies, the development of a properly colonial world economy. These first two moments were characterized by the construction of otherness on a world scale. First, the various nation states organized their populations into competing national groups who could only feel their identities by way of xenophobia and the hatred of the national enemies, who could only define their identity by opposition to their opposite numbers. But these nationalisms quickly enough took on non-national forms, as particularly in Europe, various minorities and other language speakers evolved their own national politics. Then, in that gradual enlargement, which is not to be confused with a later globalization, the system of imperialism began to colonize the world in terms of the otherness of their colonized subjects. Racial otherness and a Eurocentric or Americanocentric contempt for so-called underdeveloped or weak or subaltern cultures partitioned so-called modern people from those who were still pre-modern and separated advanced or ruling cultures from the dominated. With this moment of imperialism, modernity, the second stage of capitalism, a worldwide system of otherness is established. It will be clear then that with decolonization, all that is gradually swept away. Those subaltern others who could not speak for themselves, let alone rule themselves, now for the first time, as Jean-Paul Sartre famously put it, speak in their own voice and claim their own existential freedom. Now suddenly, the bourgeois subject is reduced to equality with all those former others, and a new kind of anonymity reigns throughout world society as a whole. Billions of real people now exist, and not just the millions of your own nation or your own language. Now, what does all this have to do with politics? I'll conclude with a few remarks on the political in postmodernity, remarks which once again are descriptive and don't pretend to offer any solutions, nor even my own personal opinions and positions on the subject. But since we were talking about space, I will put a very simple proposition to you, namely that today, all politics is about real estate. Postmodern politics is essentially a matter of land grabs on a local as well as a global scale. Whether you think of the question of Palestine, the settlements and the camps, or of the politics of raw materials and extractions, whether you think of ecology and your own rainforests, or the problem of federalism, citizenship, and immigration, or whether it's a question of gentrification in the great cities, as well as bidonville, the favelas and the townships, today everything is about land. In Marxist terms, all these struggles result from what we call the commodification of land and the dissolution of the last remnants of feudalism and its peasantries, their replacement by industrial agriculture or agribusiness and farm workers. Where is time in all this? It's to be found in the new flash crowds enabled by cell phones and texting, the new mass demonstrations of Seattle and Tiananmen, of Eastern Europe, of Tahrir Square, and of Wisconsin. These truly mark the emergence of what my friends Michael Hart and Tony Negri call multitude. But they are no longer the politics of duration, but the politics of the instant, of the present, what Negri himself has called constitutive power, as opposed to constituted power. Postmodernity in general is characterized by this new kind of present of time, a reduction of the present, a reduction of the body. In this new dialectic of omnipresent space and the temporal present, history, historicity, the sense of history is the loser. The past is gone. We can no longer imagine the future. It's clear that this waning of history confronts politics and political practice with some very serious problems, and perhaps this is the moment with those problems to break off this survey. Thank you.
Você assistiu à segunda parte da conferência, A Estética da Singularidade, com Fredric Jameson. Obrigado pela sua companhia e até o próximo Fronteiras do Pensamento.